Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, everyone. Let's get straight into it. As Steve mentioned, I'll give a quick orientation for those not familiar with Gdansk. So we're located in the Baltic Sea, southern Baltic Sea, on the Polish coast. We are the largest container terminal in the Baltic. We don't have any maritime restrictions, so no tidal restrictions, so no draft restrictions, and importantly in the Baltic, no icing either. We regularly handle on a weekly scheduled service. We're handling the largest vessels in the world, 24,000 TEU vessels, with some of the largest exchanges, certainly within Europe. And our location gives us a really, probably the most cost-effective location for serving the upper Baltic, so Russia, eastern Sweden, Baltic states. If you're bringing a feeder vessel in from the hubs to the west, you're going to be probably restricted in size. They're further away. Whereas from Gdansk, there are no size restrictions in those feeder vessels, and we are considerably closer to the markets. Also, great hinterland connections, so great rail access into not only Poland, but cross-border into the Central Eastern European, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Belarus, those markets. And we're fortunate that we don't have any immediate neighbors. We're not down the end of a river. So we have plenty of room to continue to grow and all of that. That means we have we handled over 2 million TEUs last year, and we are continuing to grow. And I'll pick up on some of those points because it sort of feeds slightly into some of the issues that I'm raising next. So challenges and opportunities. I think at this stage, obviously, it's still very early days, right? So I think we are the challenges I'm raising there really are the challenges we're seeing as a direct impact, and I say economic impact, of the COVID-19 outbreak itself. Of course, this is not to detract at all from the terrible human and health-related consequences, so purely focusing on the economic impacts. But issue number one we've seen, of course, is reduced volumes on the key trades, and that's somewhat coming in two parts. First, of course, we saw supply shock. When COVID outbreak happened in China and rolled out through Asia, we saw that initial hit as we moved into February and into the shutdown of key production centers. And that caused, of course, the initial supply shock. And at DCT, for example, we had two void sailings as lines tried to adjust around that. We're now moving, as we come into Q2, into what seems to be an even deeper impact, that of the demand shock, right? So we're now seeing from what I understand, reports in excess of 30% reduction in the number of calls made in some of the key ports into Felixstowe, into Antwerp and other locations. And I think in some of the Mediterranean ports, a 40% reduction in vessel calls during this quarter. So that's all driven by the demand shock that's happening in Europe as governments have rightly taken the right kind of action to lock down, try and minimize infection rates. So I think one of the opportunity there is that lines are thinking, how can they still continue to serve those markets as efficiently as possible? And how can they still seek out the stronger markets? Where are the market opportunities where they're still going to see growth? Where are the markets and economies that are going to start recovering from this lockdown, perhaps more robustly than other locations? And I think that's one of the things that we'll touch on a bit later on. Landside, we're seeing it in many locations. There have been, throughout the Schengen area, reintroduction of border controls, or borders even being closed, again, rightly so, to control the spread of COVID-19. That's causing issues for truck drivers. There have been queues at borders. And it's obviously going to be difficult. Those challenges are going to remain. And I think what we've seen, even in this fairly short period, is rail, in fact, holding strong. If I look at our own volumes at DCT, the actual rail percentage of traffic has actually increased as a relative of the total gate traffic that we've seen. So rail is clearly still able to operate under those kinds of conditions and provides a strong, resilient link for serving markets where trucking is having or has had some difficulties. And that may be an issue that perhaps is a longer term trend. And then, of course, we look at the processes. I mean, clearly, we've all had to adapt very, very rapidly to trying to reduce the potential for infection rates, protecting employees, protecting our customers, and taking all the necessary and right actions to make sure that happens. And and to pick up on a point that that Robert had earlier, I mean, we've all very quickly adapted to remote working, something which I think many people have been trying to push for a number of years, and yet overnight we've been able to make that happen. So those kinds of trends, I think, clearly will stay for the long term. And I think the opportunity, therefore, is to accelerate the long sought or talked about digitalization of trade lanes, of information, the EDI exchange. I think digital platforms will start to have a real growth spurt on the back of trying to reduce that interaction of personnel wherever possible. And I think a follow on from that then is the automation of processes where possible too. So that may well be another acceleration trend that we're starting to see, based around purely upon, I suppose, the challenges that the infection rates have presented themselves. So that's the immediate set of challenges we're faced, and that's related to the actual outbreak of the virus. But perhaps we're now starting to move, as we come out of second quarter, as we're starting to see some of the economies starting to reduce their lockdown activities. We're starting to see economies trying to open up, to use the overused phrase, to whatever that new normal may become. So we're starting to move into perhaps the economic impacts of the outbreak. And I think clearly still very early days, very, very difficult to say what those are going to be. So the report I have here is from the IMF. And that's showing us, I suppose, a snapshot of before. So we look at 2019, that's our baseline. GDP growth across the whole of Europe was at 1.2%. Poland, therefore, was somewhat a shining star in the GDP forecasts at over 4.3%. And even as we moved into the earlier part of January, early part of this year, EU kind of similar kind of growth rate at 1.2, 1.3%. Poland still was forecast to outperform significantly the average growth. And in fact, when we look at our DCT volumes in January, we had our strongest month ever. So the year started very well. A few short months later, and we have a somewhat different picture, where the growth forecast now for the EU as a whole has now dropped to a negative 6.4%. And we're seeing major impacts on big economy. Our immediate neighbor to the west, Germany, negative 7% growth. But again, if we look at the impact on the Polish economy, yes, it's a negative growth rate, but not so heavily impacted as some of the others around us. And I think, again, if we're looking for how do you, as a shipper or as a forwarder or a shipping line, how do you adjust to the impacts, the economic impacts of the outbreak, then you've got to try and seek out which markets are more resilient and which markets are able to recover more rapidly and pull themselves out of the impact and the shutdowns that we've seen. And I think the Polish economy is looking to be one such opportunity. So then we can move on perhaps to what are the longer term trends, the economic related trends that we're seeing as we move out from the actual outbreak itself. Well, for lines, it's clearly going to be a very bumpy ride. As Robert pointed out, perhaps if it wasn't for the lower fuel costs and bunker costs, things would be even worse for many of them. I saw that this week Maersk reporting a negative 25% volume drop for Q2. There are some signs that perhaps it might improve in Q3. I think Jeremy Nixon from One was reporting that he thought that from July onwards things would start to pick up. So again, it's early days. We're not able to really perhaps pick any real volume trends, and we're all hopeful that things do start to recover quicker, sooner rather than later. but it's clear that there's going to be some difficulty in trying to manage your costs, and you've got to seek out maximize those opportunities. Again, so if I look at the business case for DCT, I would say that, you know, we have a strong economy. We've already got that proven ability to handle huge move counts. We handle up to 12,000 moves in a single call. And that would enable shipping lines to maximize the efficiency of a call. If you look at what some of the BCOs and forwarders are looking for, well, probably one of the lessons that has come out of the outbreak is greater resilience required in supply chains. Many reports on, is this the death of the just-in-time supply chain? And so I think a lot are looking at other solutions for near sourcing. I think that's an issue that Robert picked up on. But the other one would be, even if that isn't the immediate case, certainly are there ways that we can have improved warehousing around the ports? Are we able to see ports and terminals offer some kind of value add to that supply chain to assist the BCOs in making sure they've got a greater level of resilience if there are, for example, future shutdowns? I mean, it's perfectly possible that we may not see perhaps a global second wave, but you might see regional spiking in infection rates that require a back step on some of the reduction measures. You might need to sort of go back to a tighter lockdown again, and therefore, you know, we're all going to have to adjust to that and still try and maintain supply chains going forward. So de-risking supply chains for BCOs and forwarders is clearly going to be something that ports and terminals can assist in, and a way that we can help those markets. And then coming back to that last point that I raised before, the overall supply chain, the advance of digital shipping, the advance of digital platforms, and improving contactless processes, those are things that we're all going to need to accelerate. An example we've got at our terminal would be, we've recently moved to a fully automated gate process. So, you know, historically the truck driver used to have to get out of his vehicle, had to go to a pre-gate desk and would have to interact with someone there. We've now got that fully automated, so it's run by OCR cameras. The driver doesn't need to leave his vehicle. So those kinds of processes, enhancing our EDI interchange with customers, all of that will go many steps forward to trying to improve the contactless process and ensuring that we can maintain operations as robustly as possible, even if there are future outbreaks, or even if we've got people working remotely, etc. So I think those are some of the key trends I think we're seeing based from the economic challenges that are rising. And I think just picking up on last point that Robert raised, which was agility and flexibility. I think that clearly is going to be key for all of us, that whatever happens, you've got to be able to be prepared to react quickly. If there's a regional spike and you need to reintroduce some of the lockdown measures, you need to do that swiftly. If a customer needs to shift volume around, you need to be able to react quickly. So flexibility is going to be a key part of how your services are evaluated by shippers and forwarders, and being able to ensure that creates greater resilience for their supply chains and their business. Okay, so I think that takes me to the end of that. So probably within around 10 minutes. I wasn't watching the clock there, Steve, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cameron. A really good summation. And there's a few things that we'll come back to during the Q&A. And while we're just waiting for Alexandru to get himself ready, one question where you talk about a drop in I think it was ship calls of around about 30%. The comment or observation from Peter Hill was that ship operators may be putting in less calls, but they've been moving to bigger vessels. So, I mean, has there been a commensurate drop in trade volumes as well for you?
Yeah, actually, it's a good point. I think throughout the second quarter, so we talked about the supply shock coming from China, and we had 2 void sailings then. But throughout the second quarter, where we're seeing a much greater number of void sailings, I think some services have been suspended. At DCT, we don't have any. I think we're one of the 7 ports in Europe that doesn't have any void sailings for Q2. That's out of Asia. I suspect some other ports are also suffering. Now we're starting to see the impact of transatlantic trade and some of the north-south trades. There may be void sailings there as well. But so far we haven't seen that. And it's a good point. The services we have are the largest vessels in the respective operators' fleets, and they are the largest exchanges that they do in Europe. So we do already have a very huge, large exchange of containers on the services that are calling it DCT. As I said, yeah, we handled over 12,000 moves on a vessel early last year. So again, I think that's a case where lines are looking where they've got to make some adjustments and consolidate their volume. Fortunately for us, we're already fairly well placed for